The message came on a Tuesday. Not a particularly special Tuesday, just your average, run-of-the-mill Tuesday, where humanity was going about its business of political squabbles, climate crises, and cat videos. The kind of Tuesday where nobody expects to hear from the self-proclaimed strongest warriors in the galaxy. But there it was, broadcast simultaneously on every screen, speaker, and neural interface across the planet, a massive, purple-skinned alien with ridges where eyebrows should be, armor that looked like it was designed by someone who'd watched too many gladiator movies, and enough weapons to make a military parade look like a toy store. "People of Earth," the alien boomed in surprisingly good English. "I am Grand Marshal Krox of the Karnax Imperium, master of 17 star systems and conqueror of the Orion Spur. We have observed your primitive civilization and find it." The world collectively held its breath except for Dave in accounting, who chose that moment to microwave fish in the break room. Some things never change, even during first contact. "The Karnax Imperium offers you a singular honor," Krox continued. "Prove your species' combat worthiness through a series of ritualized battles, or face immediate subjugation as a Class 3 servitor race. You have 48 Earth hours to select your champion and respond." The transmission ended with what could only be described as the galactic equivalent of dropping the mic, a ceremonial weapon thrust into what appeared to be the skull of some unfortunate previous challenger. "Well said, President Okafor," to the hastily assembled World Security Council. That escalated quickly. Around the table sat the usual mix of military brass, scientific minds, and political figures, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. All except one. Admiral Tessa Reynolds sat ramrod straight, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a tight bun, her uniform pristine despite having been summoned from a training exercise in the Mojave Desert. While others fidgeted, she studied the replay of the alien message with the same cool detachment she'd used to analyze a weather report. "Thoughts?" Admiral, the President asked. Reynolds paused the playback on a frame showing the aliens' extensive arsenal. "They want a show of force to determine whether we're worth respecting or simply conquering. Classic dominance display. I've seen gorillas with more subtlety." "And your recommendation?" "Give them what they want." Initially a smile that had nothing to do with humor crossed Reynolds' face. "Then give them what they deserve." General Harris, never Reynolds' biggest fan, snorted. "You're volunteering to fight?" That he gestured at the frozen image of Krox, who looked like he bench-pressed tanks for a warm-up. "I'm volunteering to win." General Reynolds' voice could have frozen nitrogen. The Karnax clearly value physical prowess and adherence to combat ritual. They've likely conquered through predictable, rule-bound engagements. So yes, I'll represent Earth not because I'm the strongest, but because I understand something fundamental about human warfare. "And what's that?" asked the President. "We don't fight fair. We never have. From the first caveman who brought a stick to a fistfight to our modern battlefield tactics, humans win. Because we refuse to play by anyone else's rulebook." Reynolds stood, adjusting her uniform with practiced precision. "The Karnax want to see if we're worthy warriors. Fine. Let's show them what happens when we stop being polite and start getting real." As she left to prepare, someone muttered, "God help the aliens." No, Reynolds replied without turning. "God help anyone who thinks humanity will roll over when threatened. We didn't climb to the top of our own food chain by following the rules." 3 days later, Earth's response team found themselves aboard the Karnax flagship, a vessel that looked like someone had given a 14-year-old unlimited resources and told them to design something menacing. Spikes protruded from every conceivable surface. Even the chairs had spikes. The coffee cups probably had spikes. Admiral Reynolds stood at the center of a circular chamber that screamed intimidation theater, surrounded by various alien dignitaries who all seemed to be competing in an unspoken who can wear the most skulls contest. Beside her stood Dr. Marcus Lee, exobiologist and diplomatic advisor, who hadn't stopped sweating since they boarded. On her other side was Jack Finley, her unconventional tactical advisor, a man whose casual stance and perpetual smirk belied the fact that he'd once outmaneuvered 3 enemy battalions with nothing but a food truck and a mariachi band. The Karnax Dominion has existed for 12 millennia, droned Sub-Commander Vex, a slightly smaller version of Krox with fewer medals but compensating with additional face scars. Our combat protocols are sacred and inviolable. Finley leaned toward Reynolds and whispered, "Notice how they keep saying inviolable." $5 says that's the exact thing we need to violate. Reynolds maintained her poker face, but internally agreed. Every culture had its pressure points, those sacred cows, just begging to be tipped over. The trials will consist of 3 challenges, Vex continued, unfurling a scroll that reached the floor and then some. First, the combat of physical prowess. Second, the battle of strategic minds. Third, the ultimate test of warrior spirit. Each contest follows ancient protocols dating back to. What happens if we win? Reynolds interrupted, causing several Karnax to gasp at her audacity. Vex blinked all 4 of his eyes in sequence, clearly unused to interruptions. If by some astronomical improbability your species prevails, you will be granted protected status within the Imperium. And if we lose? Your planet becomes a resource extraction colony. Your people will serve the Imperium in various capacities. Those with combat potential may earn limited citizenship through gladiatorial service. Reynolds nodded as if considering a slightly overpriced menu item. And the rules of engagement? Weapons? Limitations? Vex gestured, and 2 attendants brought forward a tablet-like device about the size of a coffee table. The Codex of Combat contains all 17,842 regulations. You are expected to memorize them before tomorrow's first trial. Dr. Lee made a small, strangled sound. One moment Reynolds said, examining the massive rulebook. This states that Earth's chosen champion must face each Karnax challenger alone. But it also says I'm allowed a tactical advisor present during each confrontation. Vex nodded reluctantly. It is tradition. Though the advisor may only offer counsel, not participate. Reynolds turned to Finley, who was already sporting his trademark "I've got an idea" grin. Thoughts, Jack? Oh, I've got several. Admiral Finley's eyes sparkled with mischief. Rule 1752 allows for performance-enhancing verbal encouragement, and Rule 12,400 states that psychological warfare consistent with a warrior's cultural norms is permissible. You read all that already, Dr. Lee whispered, impressed. Nah, Finley whispered back. I just made those up to see how they'd react. Based on the Karnax official's expressions of horror, he'd struck gold. We accept your terms, Reynolds announced formally, not bothering to look through the rest of the rulebook. Earth will participate in your trials. As they were escorted back to their temporary quarters, Dr. Lee finally found his voice. Admiral, with all due respect, how are we supposed to win against a warrior culture that's been conquering species for millennia? By doing what humans have always done when faced with a technologically superior enemy, Reynolds replied. We cheat. The rules are a weapon, Finley interjected, tossing a small object he'd somehow pilfered from the council chamber. And not the only one. While you were sweating through your shirt, I counted 14 structural weaknesses in their combat arena, identified their communication protocols, and stole this. He held up what appeared to be an ornate pin. What is it? Asked Lee. No idea. But it looked important, and the big guy with all the face tentacles seemed really attached to it. Finley grinned. Also, I may have reprogrammed their translation matrix to replace the word honor with bubble bath. Reynolds allowed herself a small smile. The Karnax think warfare is about strength and tradition. They're expecting us to play their game to try beating them at what they do best. But we're not going to do that, Lee realized. Precisely, Reynolds nodded. Tomorrow they're expecting a dignified representative of Earth to follow their sacred combat protocols. Instead, Finley added cheerfully, they're getting us. Back in the Karnax council chamber, Vex approached Grand Marshal Krox with visible concern. Most exalted one, I fear the humans may not be taking our sacred traditions seriously. Krox dismissed the concern with a wave of his massive hand. They are small, soft creatures who have never left their own star system. What could they possibly know of true warfare? If he could have seen Admiral Reynolds at that moment, methodically reviewing the Karnax's own combat footage, while Finley disassembled their gift of ceremonial armor to find its weaknesses, he might have been considerably less confident. The combat arena of the Karnax flagship resembled what would happen if the Roman Colosseum had a baby with a heavy metal album cover. Bone-white spires stretched toward a domed ceiling that simulated an alien sky, complete with 3 moons that occasionally blinked, which moons generally shouldn't do. The floor was covered in a substance that looked suspiciously like dried blood but smelled like cinnamon. thousands of Karnax spectators filled the tiered seating, creating a cacophony of guttural chants and rhythmic stomping. In a special observation box, Grand Marshal Krox lounged on what could only be described as a throne made of weapons welded together. Admiral Reynolds stood at one end of the arena, wearing the modified Karnax ceremonial armor. Modified because Finley had spent the night making several unauthorized improvements. Testing. Finley's voice came through the nearly invisible earpiece Reynolds wore. "Can you hear me, Admiral?" "Affirmative," she muttered. "What's our status?" "Their champion is coming out now." And, wow, just wow. The opposite doors swung open to reveal a Karnax warrior who made Grand Marshal Krox look positively petite. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, with arms thicker than Reynolds' torso and armor adorned with so many trophies it looked like a walking museum of conquest, the champion stomped toward the center of the arena. "Behold," announced a Karnax herald, "Champion Krox the Undefeated, Slayer of the Regelian Horde, Crusher of the Arcturan Rebellion, Devourer of the..." The list continued for what felt like several geological epochs. "They're really into their titles, aren't they?" Finley commented in Reynolds' ear. "Should we start calling you Admiral Reynolds, filler outer of triplicate fawns, destroyer of budget meetings?" Reynolds suppressed a smile as she approached the center to meet her opponent. Up close, Krox was even more intimidating. His skin wasn't just purple, it was mottled with scars that formed a topographical map of violence. Tiny human Krox rumbled, his voice so deep it made the arena floor vibrate. "I shall honor you with a swift death." The herald approached with a case containing ceremonial weapons. "The first trial is the combat of physical prowess. As challenged species, Earth may select the weapon category." Reynolds examined the options. Bladed weapons the size of street signs. Blunt instruments that would require a forklift to move. Energy weapons that hummed with ominous power. "According to Section 42 of the Codex," she said loudly, "I may select a weapon from my own culture if it falls within acceptable parameters." The herald looked flustered. "Well, yes, but..." "I choose these." Reynolds held up her hands, now covered in the modified gauntlets Finley had prepared with what appeared to be earth boxing gloves incorporated into the design. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Krox looked confused, then amused. "You choose to fight unarmed," he laughed, a sound like boulders in a washing machine. "Your species is either very brave or very stupid." "You'd be surprised how often those overlap," Reynolds replied. The herald reluctantly signaled the beginning of combat. Krox immediately adopted a formal stance that looked like it came straight from an ancient martial arts scroll. Reynolds did not. Instead of mirroring the ceremonial stance, she bounced lightly on her toes, hands raised in a classic boxer's guard. The crowd fell into confused silence. "What is this?" Krox demanded. "You must begin with the stance of honorable intent." "Yeah." "About that," Reynolds replied. "I didn't really read that part of the rulebook." Before Krox could process this sacrilege, Reynolds darted forward, not with the slow, deliberate movement of Karnax combat ritual, but with the quick, efficient motion of someone who didn't have time for this nonsense. She delivered a rapid combination of punches to Krox's midsection. The punches themselves barely made the massive alien flinch. But that wasn't the point. "What? What is happening?" Krox suddenly wobbled, looking disoriented. "Remember those modifications I made to your gloves?" Finley said in Reynolds' ear. "Each impact delivers a localized electromagnetic pulse that interferes with their neural armor. Their combat suits enhance their natural abilities, and you're basically hitting their off switch." Reynolds didn't waste time. While Krox was struggling to understand why his limbs weren't responding properly, she continued her attack, targeting joints, pressure points, and the small gaps between armor plates that Finley had identified from studying Karnax physiology. "This is not honorable combat," Krox roared, swinging wildly. "You must follow the sacred sequence." "Here's the thing about humans," Reynolds replied, ducking under a massive but sluggish blow. "We don't really do sacred sequences, we're more improvisational." The crowd was now in an uproar. Grand Marshal Krox had risen from his throne, his face contorted in outrage. "You dare mock our traditions," Krox bellowed, managing to catch Reynolds with a glancing blow that sent her skidding across the arena floor. Reynolds rolled back to her feet, spitting blood but grinning. I'm not mocking anything. I'm just fighting to win. Big difference. Fight with honor, someone shouted from the crowd. Honor doesn't keep my planet free, Reynolds called back. Results do. She charged forward again, this time leaping at the last second and using Krox's own armor protrusions as handholds to scramble up his massive frame. Before he could react, she had reached his helmet and jammed her gauntlet against a specific point where the neural controls connected. Krox froze, then collapsed like a marionette with cut strings. The arena fell into stunned silence as Reynolds stood over her fallen opponent, barely winded. Technical knockout, Finley announced through their communicator loud enough for the nearest Karnax to hear. Or as we like to call it on Earth, fighting smarter, not harder. Grand Marshal Krox's voice boomed across the arena. This is unprecedented. The combat ritual was not properly observed. Check your rulebook, Reynolds replied calmly. Nowhere does it state that I must fight using Karnax techniques, only that I must defeat your champion. Which I have done. The Karnax legal experts huddled together in frantic consultation, flipping through their massive codex. She is. Technically correct, one finally admitted, looking like he'd rather swallow his own ceremonial dagger than make this announcement. The human has won the first trial. As Reynolds was escorted from the arena, she caught Finley's eye in the diplomatic observation box. He gave her a subtle thumbs up. That was just round one, he murmured through the con. They're going to adapt. Next time will be harder. Good, Reynolds replied quietly. Because we're just getting started. Back in the Karnax command chamber, Grand Marshal Krox was demolishing furniture in rage. They made a mockery of our sacred combat traditions, he roared. Sub-Commander Vex cautiously approached. Perhaps, Exalted One, we underestimated these humans. Nonsense. They are primitives with primitive tactics. Krox seized a holographic display showing Reynolds' fighting technique. But they will learn. The next champion will be prepared for their rudeness. What neither of them realized was that rudeness was about to become the least of their concerns. Word of the humans' unorthodox victory spread through the Karnax flagship faster than a rumor at a high school reunion. Crew members whispered about the small pink creature who had defeated their champion without observing proper combat etiquette, a concept so foreign to the Karnax that several of their translators had suffered minor meltdowns trying to process it. Meanwhile, in the Earth delegation's quarters, Admiral Reynolds was reviewing footage of the fight with Finley when there was a knock at the door. Enter, Reynolds called, and the door slid open to reveal a human woman with bright red hair tied back in a practical ponytail, wearing what appeared to be standard-issue Earth military fatigues that had been customized in several non-regulation ways. Casey Wong reporting for duty, Admiral, she announced with a casual salute that would have given any drill sergeant an aneurysm. Though most people call me Rabbit. Reynolds nodded. Glad you could make it. Jack, this is Lieutenant Casey Wong, our psychological warfare specialist. Psychological warfare, Finley raised an eyebrow. I thought that was my department. Rabbit grinned. Your amateur hour, Finley. No offense. Full offense taken, Finley replied, but he was smiling. The Karnax are adapting, Reynolds explained, gesturing to the screen where they'd been analyzing the aftermath of the first contest. They're modifying their neural armor to resist our countermeasures, and the next champion will likely be prepared for unconventional physical tactics. So we need to get inside their heads instead of just punching them, Rabbit nodded, dropping into a chair and propping her feet on the table. That's where I come in. I've studied every piece of intel we have on Karnax culture. Their warriors are essentially walking PTSD cases with anger management issues and egos the size of Jupiter. And how exactly do we use that, Finley asked. Rabbit's smile would have made a shark nervous. The second trial is the battle of strategic minds, right? A test of tactical thinking, planning, and execution. According to the Codex, yes, Reynolds confirmed. Perfect, Rabbit cracked her knuckles. Because humans don't just break physical rules, we break brains. The second arena was configured differently, now resembling something between a chessboard and a battlefield simulator. The Karnax spectators seemed more subdued, watching with suspicious eyes as Reynolds entered with Rabbit at her side. Who is this? Demanded the Karnax officiator, pointing at Rabbit. My tactical advisor Reynolds replied smoothly, "As permitted by Section 312 of your Codex." The officiator frowned but couldn't dispute this. The doors opposite them opened to reveal a Karnax strategist slightly smaller than Grodox, but with an enlarged cranial ridge that apparently signified intelligence among their species. He wore less physical armor but more medals and decorative patterns that presumably demonstrated tactical achievements. "I am Strategist Prime Zolnar the Karnax announced. I have conquered 17 worlds through superior tactical analysis. You will not find me as unprepared as Grodox." "Looking forward to it," Reynolds replied with professional courtesy. The officiator explained the rules. The battle of strategic minds would take place on the massive holographic board between them. Each would command a simulated army with the objective of capturing the other's command center. The simulation would respond to their inputs in real time, representing a compressed battlefield scenario. As the challenged species, the officiator stated, Earth may select the battlefield terrain. Reynolds glanced at Rabbit, who nodded subtly. "We choose urban environment," Reynolds announced. "Specifically, a simulation of an Earth city." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Zolnar looked momentarily concerned but quickly composed himself. "Your choice merely delays your defeat," he stated confidently. The arena darkened, and the holographic board erupted into a detailed cityscape: buildings, streets, parks, and various infrastructure elements. "Begin," the officiator declared. Zolnar immediately began deploying his forces with practiced precision, spreading them through strategic choke points with textbook military efficiency. It was immediately apparent that he was indeed an experienced tactician. Reynolds, meanwhile, appeared to be deploying her forces randomly, some concentrated in unusual locations, others scattered with no apparent strategy. Zolnar's confidence grew visibly. "Your tactics are chaotic and undisciplined," he commented, as his forces began a coordinated advance through the main thoroughfares. "That's what they all say," Reynolds replied calmly. Rabbit leaned in and whispered something to Reynolds, who nodded and made a seemingly minor adjustment to her deployment. What happened next confused everyone, including, apparently, Zolnar's own troops. As his forces advanced, they suddenly encountered unexpected obstacles. Traffic signals changed erratically. Building security systems activated. Public transportation vehicles moved in unpredictable patterns. "What is this?" Zolnar demanded. "Urban warfare," Reynolds replied. "We're not just fighting your troops, we're using the city itself." Rabbit stepped forward. "On Earth, we learned long ago that the environment is a weapon. That infrastructure can be manipulated. That civilian systems can be militarized." "This is not proper military doctrine," Zolnar protested as his formations began to fragment, caught in a series of cascading chaos events. "Exactly," Rabbit grinned. "And that's why you're losing." As Zolnar struggled to reorganize his forces, Reynolds' scattered units suddenly converged in coordinated strikes, emerging from subways, appearing on rooftops, attacking from sewers. "You're fighting like your people have for millennia," Rabbit continued, a voice carrying to the nearest spectators. "We're fighting like we learned to over just the last century. The rate of our tactical evolution is, well, frankly, it's terrifying. We scare ourselves sometimes." Zolnar's expression shifted from confidence to concern to outright panic as his carefully organized forces were ambushed from multiple directions simultaneously. "This is not warfare," he finally exploded. This is chaos." "No," Reynolds corrected as her forces surrounded Zolnar's command center. "This is humanity. We don't just adapt to chaos, we weaponize it." The simulation ended with the capture of Zolnar's command post. The officiator reluctantly declared Earth the winner of the second trial. As they left the arena, Finley met them in the corridor, grinning widely. "That was brilliant. What exactly did you do in there?" "I introduced them to asymmetric warfare," Rabbit explained, "with a dash of what we call the Chicago effect, named after a city where our traffic lights cause more chaos than our tactical planning ever could." "They're not going to take this well," Reynolds noted as they heard the sounds of Karnax outrage behind them. "That's the point," Rabbit replied. "Their entire combat doctrine is based on predictability, tradition, and defined patterns. We're showing them something their millennia of conquest never prepared them for: an enemy that doesn't play by any recognizable rulebook." Back in the Karnax command center, Grand Marshal Krox was in a state that could only be described as thermonuclear fury. Twice he roared, his voice causing nearby equipment to vibrate. Twice they have made mockeries of our sacred traditions. Sub-Commander Vex approached cautiously. Perhaps, most exalted one, we should reconsider. No, Krox slammed his massive fist down, cracking the command table. The final trial will settle this. The ultimate test of warrior spirit cannot be subverted by their primitive trickery. I will oversee it personally. You, Great One, Vex asked, surprised. You would personally engage in combat with the human? Yes, Krox growled, his eyes narrowing to glowing slits. And I will show them what happens when the Karnax stop being accommodating. What Krox didn't realize was that accommodating had never been in humanity's vocabulary when it came to existential threats. And Admiral Reynolds was already planning for the final confrontation, one that would redefine the Karnax understanding of warrior spirit forever. The atmosphere aboard the Karnax flagship had changed dramatically. Gone was the ceremonial pomp and circumstance that had characterized the first two trials. The corridors were now lined with fully armed guards, the lighting dimmed to an ominous purple glow, and the general vibe had shifted from ritual combat exhibition to we're seriously considering blowing up your planet. In the Earth delegation's quarters, Reynolds, Finley and Rabbit were engaged in what military professionals call tactical planning and what everyone else would call making it up as they go along. The final challenge is the ultimate test of warrior spirit, Reynolds said, reviewing the information they had. According to the Codex, it's a direct confrontation between champions that tests not just combat ability, but the essence of what makes a warrior. Very poetic, Finley remarked dryly, and utterly meaningless. Not to the Karnax, Rabbit countered. I've analyzed their psychological profiles. To them, warrior spirit encompasses their entire philosophy, honor, tradition, strength, lineage. It's everything. Which means they're going to throw everything they have at us, Reynolds concluded. No more specialized champions. My guess is Krox himself will face me. Finley whistled. The big boss, Hugh. Going right to the final level. The question is, Reynolds continued, what does this final test actually entail? The Codex is frustratingly vague. Dr. Lee, who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. I've been studying their historical records. The ultimate test typically involves a one-on-one confrontation in what they call the sphere of truth, a specialized arena where both participants are supposedly stripped of advantages and must rely solely on their inner warrior. Stripped of advantages, Finley frowned. That sounds suspiciously like they're going to take away all our clever toys. Precisely, Reynolds nodded. Which means we need something they can't take away, something they won't even recognize as a weapon. A slow smile spread across Rabbit's face. I think I know just the thing. The sphere of truth lived up to its name, at least in terms of geometry. A perfect spherical chamber at the heart of the Karnax flagship, its walls shimmered with an energy field that cast everything in a golden light. At the center was a simple circular platform, no technology, no weapons, just bare floor. The Karnax had gathered in full ceremonial regalia. The atmosphere was tense, expectant, like the air before a thunderstorm. Reynolds stood at one entrance to the sphere, wearing only the simplest of Earth military uniforms, no armor, no technology, no gadgets. As required by the trial, she had surrendered all equipment before entering. Or at least, all physical equipment. Grand Marshal Krox entered from the opposite side, similarly unadorned except for ritual markings painted across his massive purple form. He looked like anger personified, his eyes literally glowing with rage. Human, he rumbled, his voice echoing in the spherical chamber. You have mocked our ways. You have dishonored our traditions. You have subverted the meaning of combat itself. From your perspective, perhaps, Reynolds replied calmly. From ours, we've simply been doing what we've always done, surviving. The ultimate test cannot be tricked or manipulated, Krox declared. Here, in the sphere of truth, only true warrior spirit prevails. No technology. No tactics. Just the pure essence of combat. About that, Reynolds said, stepping onto the platform. I'm curious, what exactly does this test measure? How do you determine the winner? The question seemed to catch Krox off guard. The sphere measures the strength of warrior spirit. The superior warrior prevails. Yes, but how? Points? Knockout? Divine intervention? Krox's brow furrowed. The measurement is ineffable. It is known when it is witnessed. So subjective. Then Reynolds nodded. Interesting. Finley and Rabbit watched from the observation area, tense but confident. Beside them, Dr. Lee fidgeted nervously. Does she have a plan? Lee whispered. Always, Finley replied. The officiator stepped forward. The ultimate test of warrior spirit will now commence. Both champions will engage until one's warrior spirit is proven superior. Begin. Krox immediately dropped into a formal combat stance that somehow managed to look both ancient and lethal. Reynolds didn't. Instead, she casually clasped her hands behind her back and began to speak. Let me tell you about Earth's history of warfare, Grand Marshal, she said conversationally. It's quite fascinating, really. Krox paused, momentarily confused by this non-aggressive opening. You dare to lecture me? Engage in combat. Oh, I am Reynolds replied. You see, humans learned long ago that the most powerful weapon isn't a fist or a blade or even a nuclear warhead. It's the mind. She began to slowly circle Krox, maintaining the same relaxed posture. Earth has had thousands of wars. Not just 17 or 20 or however many your empire has fought. Thousands. We've killed each other over land, resources, religion, ideology, and sometimes just because someone drew a map wrong. Krox lunged forward with a powerful strike that should have ended the confrontation immediately, but Reynolds simply stepped aside with surprising grace. We've developed more ways to kill each other than your empire has planets, she continued, unperturbed. But do you know what we discovered? The most successful warriors aren't the strongest or the most technically proficient. They're the ones who understand their enemy. The sphere had fallen completely silent. Even the Karnax spectators were transfixed. And for instance, Reynolds continued, dodging another attack with minimal movement. I understand that your entire empire is built on the concept of honorable combat. It's your religion, your government, your social structure all in one. But I also understand it's built on a fundamental contradiction. Silence, Krox roared, launching a series of increasingly frantic attacks that Reynolds continued to avoid with almost insulting ease. You claim to value strength above all, she continued, yet you constrain it with endless rituals and rules. True strength adapts. True strength adapts. True strength evolves. Your empire hasn't faced a real challenge in so long that you've forgotten what actual warfare looks like. Krox was becoming visibly frustrated, his attacks growing wilder. Fight me properly. This is how humans fight when everything is on the line, Reynolds replied. We identify weaknesses and we exploit them mercilessly. And your biggest weakness, Grand Marshal, is that you don't understand what you're facing. She suddenly stopped moving, standing directly before Krox. Hit me. Krox hesitated, suspicious of the sudden change. Go ahead, Reynolds encouraged. One clean hit. Show everyone your superior strength. Krox's massive fist swung forward and Reynolds didn't move. The blow connected solidly with her shoulder, sending her skidding across the platform. The Karnax spectators roared in approval. Reynolds stood up slowly, rotating her injured shoulder with a wince. Impressive. That would have killed most humans. Then you admit defeat, Krox demanded. No. I just proved my point, Reynolds replied. You think warfare is about who can hit harder. We learned it's about who can take the hit and keep fighting. Earth hasn't survived this long because we're the strongest. We've survived because we're too stubborn to stay down. She stepped forward, unarmed, injured, but somehow radiating more authority than the massive alien warlord before her. Your empire conquers through fear and force. But Earth? Earth's history is written by those who refuse to submit, even when all logical analysis said they should. Sparta against Persia, the Soviet winter against Napoleon, guerrilla fighters against mechanized armies. Again and again, we've proven that spirit isn't measured by how hard you can hit, but by what you can endure. The golden light of the sphere had begun to shift, swirling around Reynolds as she spoke. The Karnax murmured in confusion. This is impossible, one of the officiators whispered. The sphere responds to her words. Because they're true, Rabbit murmured from the observation area. The sphere of truth, remember. Reynolds continued, her voice carrying throughout the chamber. You wanted to test warrior spirit? This is humanity's warrior spirit. Not mindless aggression, not rigid adherence to tradition, but adaptability, tenacity, and the absolute refusal to be subjugated no matter the odds. The golden light now enveloped her completely, shining more brightly than it ever had for a Karnax warrior. "We don't need to defeat you in combat," Grand Marshal Reynolds concluded. "We just need to show you that trying to conquer Earth would cost you more than you're willing to pay. Because humans don't surrender when the battle is hopeless. That's when we get creative. That's when we get dangerous." Krox stood frozen, the massive alien warlord seemingly at a loss for words as the sphere itself appeared to recognize Reynolds' words as the embodiment of true warrior spirit. "The human," the officiator finally announced, sounding bewildered, ... has prevailed in the ultimate test." The silence that followed was absolute until Finley whispered, "Did she just win an alien combat trial by giving a speech?" "Not just any speech," Rabbit replied with undisguised admiration. "The most human speech possible." The treaty signing ceremony aboard the Karnax flagship couldn't have been more different from their first encounter. Gone were the excessive spikes, skull decorations, and intimidation theater. The chamber had been reconfigured into something almost diplomatic, though the Karnax clearly had only the vaguest idea what diplomatic looked like. Their attempt included fewer weapons on display, but still featured an alarming number of ceremonial daggers repurposed as office supplies. Admiral Reynolds, now recovered from her shoulder injury, sat across from Grand Marshal Krox. The massive alien warlord had been uncharacteristically quiet since the final trial, his typical bluster replaced by something approaching thoughtfulness and novel experience for him, judging by his expression. "The Treaty of Protected Status is prepared," announced Sub-Commander Vex, who had somehow survived Krox's multiple rage episodes and now served as diplomatic liaison. "Earth will be recognized as a sovereign system under its own governance, with full non-aggression guarantees from the Karnax Imperium." Dr. Lee reviewed the document carefully before nodding to Reynolds. "The terms are acceptable, better than acceptable, actually." "Sign," Krox ordered, though with less bombast than usual. Reynolds took the ceremonial pen, which appeared to be made from some unfortunate creature's spine, and signed Earth's first interstellar treaty. Krox followed with his own signature, which resembled a small explosion on paper. "It is done," Krox declared. "Earth is now officially recognized across the 17 systems of the Imperium. None shall threaten your world without facing our wrath." "Raise from mortal enemies to defense pact in under a week," Finley whispered to Rabbit. "That's got to be some kind of diplomatic speed record." "I have a question," Grand Marshal Reynolds said, setting down the spine pen. "Why the change of heart? We humiliated your champions and upended your traditions. By all rights, you should be plotting our destruction." Krox's four-fingered hand tapped rhythmically on the table. "The Karnax have conquered for 12 millennia. In all that time, we have faced hundreds of species with superior technology, superior numbers, even superior strength. But never have we encountered a species with such unpredictability." He leaned forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table. "Your final trial revealed a truth the sphere confirmed attempting to subjugate humanity would be inefficient." "Inefficient," Rabbit repeated with barely suppressed amusement. "You would lose battles. You would lose champions. You would lose ships and resources," Krox elaborated. "But you would never truly be conquered. You would resist in ways we cannot anticipate. You would adapt to our methods faster than we could adapt to yours. The cost would outweigh any possible benefit. So we're getting protected status not because you respect us," Finley realized, "but because we'd be too much trouble to keep as subjects." "Precisely," Krox nodded, seemingly pleased they understood. "It is the highest compliment the Imperium can bestow." Reynolds allowed herself a small smile. "We'll take it." 1 month later, the Earth delegation was preparing to return home in a newly gifted Karnax diplomatic vessel, their gesture of goodwill that everyone recognized was partly a way to save face and partly a genuine attempt to stay on humanity's good side. "Reports from across the Imperium," Admiral Dr. Lee announced, reviewing his tablet as they prepared for departure. "Apparently, word of our unconventional victories has spread. The Karnax are now using pulling a human as slang for using unexpected tactics." "Is that a compliment or an insult?" Finley wondered. "Both, I think," Rabbit replied, lounging in a chair that had been significantly modified to accommodate human comfort rather than Karnax aesthetics. But more importantly, 3 subject species have already cited our example in their own negotiations with the Imperium. Reynolds nodded approvingly. Good. The galaxy could use a shake-up. There's more, Lee continued. We've received requests from 7 different non-Imperium civilizations for defensive alliances with Earth. Apparently being known as the species too troublesome to conquer is quite the diplomatic calling card. And to think, Finley mused, all we did was refuse to play by their rules. That's humanity's superpower, Reynolds said, gazing out at the stars that now seemed much less distant. We don't just break rules, we question why they exist in the first place. As their ship departed the Karnax flagship, they could see a final message illuminated across its hull, a new addition that hadn't been there during their arrival. In the formal language of the Imperium, translated into English as a gesture of respect, it read, Earth Protected System approach with caution. Below it, in slightly smaller text, someone had added, Inhabitants may not fight fair, but they fight well. Reynolds smiled. As first impressions on the galactic stage went, she'd take it. In a distant corner of the Karnax flagship, 2 junior warriors were engaged in combat training. The younger one, frustrated after several defeats, threw down his weapon. It's impossible. You're not following the proper sequences. The older warrior shrugged. I'm trying something new. Something. Human. That's cheating, the younger one protested. Perhaps the older warrior replied thoughtfully. Or perhaps it's evolution. Across the ship, similar conversations were taking place. New tactics were being tested. Old traditions were being questioned. The rigid hierarchy was experiencing its first ripples of change in millennia. Grand Marshal Krox observed it all from his command center, his expression unreadable. Next to him, Sub-Commander Vex dared to ask the question on everyone's mind. Will this human influence weaken us? Exalted One. Krox was silent for a long moment before answering. The strongest metal is not pure, Sub-Commander. It is an alloy. Perhaps the strongest empire is also not pure, but adaptable. He turned to gaze at the departing Earth vessel, now just a distant point of light among the stars. Send word throughout the Imperium. The official designation for humans shall be honorable adversaries, with a classified addendum approach with extreme caution. As Earth's first ambassadors to the stars returned home, they carried not just a treaty but a new galactic understanding. In a universe of mighty warriors and ancient empires, humanity's greatest weapon wasn't technology or strength or even military prowess. It was their magnificent, glorious, utterly unpredictable rudeness. And somehow, that made all the difference.